Today on the Roundhouse, we're learning about an exciting new railroad where the 19th century meets the 21st century. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 103 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we talk about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we're talking to Steve Torrico. He is the General Superintendent of the Harrisburg, Lincoln, and Lancaster Railroad. Haven't heard of it yet? Well, you're going to hear more about it as time goes on, because this is a relatively new operation, but it involves familiar equipment, including the Leviathan steam locomotive and the Lincoln funeral car, which we've covered previously on the Roundhouse when we talked to its builder, David Clokey. Now, these pieces of equipment have a new home, and Steve's going to talk about what it's like working with these pieces of equipment and 19th century railroading in general, and what is happening at this new home in Pennsylvania. I hope you guys had a great holiday season and you're looking forward to what 2021 has in store. And now, let's talk to Steve. Our guest today is the General Superintendent of the Harrisburg, Lincoln, and Lancaster Railroad in Pennsylvania. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Steve Torrico.
Good afternoon, Nick. It's really great to be with you today, and I'm excited to be here at the Roundhouse. I've gotten many texts today from friends going, "Can't wait to hear you on the Roundhouse." So I know you've got a lot of fans out there.
Yes, and I've had a lot of questions submitted to you from said fans, and hopefully yours is among them. Starting off with the basics, what is the Harrisburg, Lincoln, and Lancaster Railroad?
Okay, well, it's based here in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. We're about 6 miles from Hershey on one side of us, and Lancaster's on the eastern side of us. It's a 275-acre piece of property that is made up of basically two historical pieces of property. The largest section of it was it was known as the Ironstone Ranch, and the Ironstone Ranch goes back to the Civil War period. And then the other big section of the property was property owned by the Klein family of the famous Pennsylvania chocolate maker, the Klein family. And their main factory was here in Elizabethtown. They were competitors with Hershey. So when David Abel started buying the property, he first bought the Klein property and then acquired the Ironstone Ranch. When he got the Ironstone Ranch, there was about 2/3 of a mile of a 65-foot cleared right-of-way with no overgrowth, no trees in the way. And he was curious, what is this? And so in doing some research, what he discovered was back in 1835, a railroad was chartered called the Harrisburg, Portsmouth, Mountjoy, and Lancaster. They built tracks between those cities and got the railroad open in 1838. If you rode on a train from Harrisburg to Lancaster, this is the route that you took, and it came through Elizabethtown. So in 1860, the Pennsylvania Railroad purchased this short line and folded it into their big system. And then, as I've learned, when the Pennsylvania Railroad started planning in the 1890s, when they started planning a new high-speed rail line to be built between Harrisburg and Philly, going through Lancaster, they did that, and that's the line that's there today if you ride on Amtrak between those cities. So that line was finished through Elizabethtown in 1903, and at that time, this branch line was abandoned. The tracks were removed. The property went back into the ownership of the Ironstone Ranch, and they decided to keep the right-of-way intact as a private road running through their property, which got them to the top of High Street here in Elizabethtown, where the freight sheds and freight docks were for the railroad. So this kept them from having to take their wagons and all their stuff out to Market Street and through town. So basically, when David bought the property, there was this railroad roadbed there, and it had been preserved. And interestingly, original retaining walls, dry stack retaining walls that were built between 1835 and 38 survived, and so you see some of that along the right-of-way. So that's that's basically what the railroad is that we started with. So we put tracks back down on this right-of-way, and as I like to refer to it, for probably the first time ever, we have an instance of trails to rails. So that's a good thing in our industry. So we put tracks back down on this original section, and then what got them really turned into wanting to put a train on this track is that on April 22nd, 1865, when Abraham Lincoln's funeral train departed Harrisburg that morning, it came from Harrisburg to Portsmouth, which they eventually changed the name to Middletown, through Elizabethtown, then to Mountjoy, to Lancaster, and off to Philly. So Lincoln's body traveled on these tracks through across this property. Well, David and Tierney Abel are big Lincoln fans, and when they found that story out, they were very intrigued. So the property itself is the Stone Gables Estates, home of the Ironstone Ranch. We have the Star Barn Village, St. Michael's Vineyard, the railroad, of course. Last year, or earlier this year, they acquired the 1844 Hers Mill covered bridge from Gap, and it was getting ready to collapse and fall apart, and they got it from the city of Gap, and they've moved it here to the property. So that's been saved. The entire property here, it's a faith-based ministry business. All 100% of the net proceeds from the profits that we make go to a charity here called Brittany's Hope, which is to aid abandoned children worldwide. So it's which is a nonprofit organization. So between helping Brittany's Hope and then the Abels have extreme interest in wanting to preserve, history from Lancaster County of the agricultural scene and now this railroad aspect. So I never know what they're going to find and restore and want to get on the property so people can see it and see what it was really like. So in a nutshell, that's what it is and what we're doing.
It's fantastic that this site can serve as a means of preserving both elements that are from the region, historic elements from the region, as well as, in the case of the railroad, something that was on the property directly. Now, if the Abels were Lincoln fans, then at some point they must have then heard about the Lincoln Funeral Card Project, which when I talked to David Clokey about 5 years ago, he was still the owner of the Leviathan steam locomotive and the Lincoln funeral car, which he was finishing at that point and starting to do a tour with. So how did those items become permanent fixtures at the railroad?
They, of course, as everybody probably knows, at the Roundhouse that not too far from here in New Freedom is the, they used to be called Steam Into History, and now it's I believe it's the Northern Central Railway. And in 2013, they accepted delivery from David Clokey for the second steam locomotive that he built. So the first locomotive that he built was a replica of the Leviathan, which he completed in 2009. And then he received this order for another locomotive for Steam Into History, the number 17. So that was built and delivered to them. So knowing that Lincoln traveled on that railroad over there going to Gettysburg, and so being Lincoln fans, they took the kids one Saturday and over to Steam Into History to ride behind the 17 and see Hanover Junction and all of that. And when they got done with the train ride, they were talking to the executive director, who was just told he knew who they were, and he told them about this locomotive, this beautiful locomotive was built by this gentleman, Dave Clokey from Illinois, and so that was very interesting. And then they told the Abels that he was in the process of building this replica of the Lincoln funeral car. Well, that sort of triggered David and Tierney to research the Lincoln funeral car history, and as to what happened to it, and why it was never saved, and why it burned in a fire in 1911. So that's as far as it lived. So once we got to 2015, which was the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's funeral, David, as you mentioned, David Clokey took the Leviathan and the Lincoln funeral car replica on trailers, and he took it around to a number of the cities that were on the route that the original Lincoln funeral train had run. Well, I think it was when it was in Duluth, the Abels went there and met Dave Clokey, saw the locomotive, saw the Lincoln funeral car, and were very thrilled to see that. And Tierney Abel, she is the one that asked Dave Clokey, "So what are you doing with it after this?" And Clokey had already decided he had stopped renting the Leviathan at the end of 2014, so he decided not to continue in that business. And so, he had already built the 17, and that had been delivered. And so his response to her was basically, "I don't know, I think I want to retire, and so maybe I'll find a museum to donate the Lincoln car to." And Tierney spoke right up and said, "Well, we'll build a museum and you can donate it to us." Well, that started the conversation, and they spent probably a year and a half or so in discussions. And on the property itself in Elizabethtown, off the Ironstone Ranch, a really neat aspect is the original Ironstone Ranch house and barn are standing, that have been restored from 1860. So when Lincoln's funeral train ran across the property, you could have sat on the front porch of the Ironstone farmhouse and saw Lincoln's funeral car go by. Well, Tierney was sitting on the front porch, relaxing and meditating one early evening, and she was inspired by the Lord that she saw this train and this Lincoln funeral car going in front of her across on the old right-of-way. And she went to David and she said, "David, we need to get that locomotive and get that Lincoln funeral car, and we need to operate it and run it here." So Tierney is actually the president of the railroad.
I love the determination of having this vision and doing whatever it took to see to it that that came to reality. And then along with those two pieces of equipment, now there's already one additional car.
Yeah, so when Clokey finished the Leviathan in 2009 and started renting it out to tourist railroads, it's a 440, and as everybody here at the Roundhouse knows, a 440 became a small tea kettle dinosaur very quickly, just because of their size. And I think the stat is there was only nationwide about 26,000 440s in that time period that were manufactured. The locomotives needed to get bigger and carry larger cars and so forth very quickly. So the 440 became obsolete, and so that was one of the problems that Dave Clokey had when he would rent the Leviathan out. To take it to a tourist route is, you can't really haul, you can't put a string of heavyweight cars behind it. It has a certain capacity that was designed for pulling, 45 to 60,000 pound, wooden coaches. So, and that's how I actually met Dave Clokey. Was in 2013. I was the general manager of the Saratoga North Creek Railway in upstate New York, and the railroad up there was actually built originally by Dr. Thomas Durant of Union Pacific fame, and we had a anniversary coming up of when that railroad was completed in September. 2013 was a anniversary date for when the first passenger train ran, and it had a 440 pulling it. So I had the brilliant idea and talked our corporate headquarters into letting me rent the Leviathan. And so we brought it up to North Creek, New York, and we had it for 2 weekends. And we had one 1920s Jersey Transit commuter car that it pulled very nicely. And so we made some runs on this beautiful railroad, and it was a beautiful 62-mile railroad with beautiful Class 2 tracks. So I was able to really stretch its legs, and we got it up, running at 26 miles an hour, and through the Adirondacks. It was just gorgeous. So I got to know the locomotive, and at the completion of that event, Dave Clokey liked the way that I ran his locomotive. And so for the balance of 13 and in 2014, when he would rent it out, I would go to wherever it was, and I would be his engineer for him. And so once he started the Lincoln Funeral Car project, he decided to kind of mothball the Leviathan. He took and he was good friends with Jerry Jacobson, who built a big roundhouse. And so the Leviathan sat over there in Sugar Creek, Ohio, at the Age of Steam Roundhouse for a couple of years before it came to here. So when the Abels bought the locomotive, Dave had already started years before. He had started to develop a passenger car that he could rent with the Leviathan that would be more appropriate to the style of the locomotive. Well, what he chose for a pattern was, which is kind of an Illinois history. So the Galena-Chicago Union Railroad was the first railroad in Chicago that had the first westbound passenger train out of Chicago in 1848. So they had a little locomotive, kind of a John Bull type looking locomotive, and they built this coach, and it was called the Pioneer Coach, the Pioneer Locomotive. Well, neither of the original cars survived from the 1840s. In 1947, the Chicago Northwestern Railroad built replicas of the Pioneer Locomotive and the Pioneer Coach to be used in the Chicago Railroad Fair of 48 and 49. So the replica of that locomotive is now at the Museum of Science and Industry, but the coach was just sort of built out of plywood, and it wasn't really meant for. It was just meant to be used in the show that they did, the big outdoor show pageant, the Wheels of Progress pageant. So it didn't fare so well, and Dave Clokey found the replica Pioneer coach in some farmer's backyard in Illinois, just ramshackled and, the chicken coop type, one wall was falling down and one end was missing, and wood rot, because the whole thing was made out of wood. The Chicago Northwestern guys even built the trucks with wooden truck, beams and so forth. So Clokey basically bought the remains of the car from this fellow, and he had to cut it up in pieces to transport it, took it all back to his shop, but he had all the pieces. So he had a steel frame made, and then he developed the trucks using the cast iron pieces, the journal boxes and the pedestals that the Chicago Northwestern had replicated in '47. That all survived, so he used all of that. And but the project never. By the time he got through using the Leviathan, he never really developed building the car any further. So for a number of years, he just had this steel frame sitting out in his yard. So when he sold the locomotive and the Lincoln car to the Abels, he said, "I'll tell you what, as a gift, I will throw in the completed Pioneer coach." So, which was a wonderful thing, and so we got the Leviathan locomotive, the Pioneer coach, and the Lincoln funeral car delivered to us.
Wonderful to have all these pieces united together and functioning. You've got the land with the right-of-way, you've got the track construction underway, you've got this equipment. Now, how did you come into the picture, Steve? It sounds like you already knew Dave a little bit. To put it in other terms, Larry Jensen asked the question, how do you always manage to get the fun jobs?
Well, okay, so to answer Larry Jensen's question, it's because 43 years ago, I believe, I met Larry Jensen in Jamestown, California, and I saw a guy that had a really fun job that was involved in vintage historic railroading. So I've just been inspired through my whole entire career that if you're going to do this, why not, it's the United States of America. You can do what you want to do. So I've just persevered and been lucky at every place I worked. I specifically picked because it was something I wanted to do. I never worked for a Class 1 railroad, always worked for short lines. And a number of the short lines I worked for had steam or passenger aspects to them, which is how I met Dave Clokey in September 2013. When Clokey concluded the negotiations to sell the Abels the equipment, he very nicely and much appreciated, he told the Abels, he goes, "Well, if you're going to buy this train, you need to hire this guy, Steve Torrico." And the company I was working for at this time, which was about 3 years ago, was in the process. They were in the process of shutting down the Saratoga North Creek Railway, and so I knew I had to do something. And so Dave Clokey got me introduced to the Abels. Came down here to Elizabethtown and rode around the property and heard the vision and so forth, and it just really, captured my, attention. So since we got the Pioneer coach, Clokey has received an order to build 2 more cars for us, and we just got the second car delivered here about 2 weeks ago. So it's a combine. It's a little bigger than the Pioneer coach. The Pioneer coach is very authentic to its 1848 size. Dave picked a mid-1860s the basic design for the next 2 coaches. One of them is a combine, so that's the one we got now. and then the next coach will be just a straight, day coach. So at the end of the day, we'll have the pioneer coach and then these two coaches. They're somewhat loosely based on the Bangor Ballistic replica coaches that Henry Ford built in 1924 for Greenfield Village.
What do you see as the pros and cons of working with replica equipment as opposed to if this stock was of its actual vintage?
That's easy. That's an easy answer. We're not. Let's pick probably the closest example or the best example of that would be the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City. So there you go. So there is a museum operation that has actually authentic, antique 19th century equipment that they operate, and so they have to, obviously be careful at how much they operate this equipment. They want to operate it. Some of the coaches, they just don't operate anymore. You just get to look at them. So you don't, we're not wearing out artifacts. That's a big plus.
It means that you can have replacement parts and keep it up to 100% because nothing has to be preserved from being historic fabric.
Right. And, as a lot of people have discovered since we, got the Leviathan here, the Locomotive is no longer called the Leviathan. It's no longer number 63. I've taken a little bit of heat for that, but this is my attitude. It's not a historical artifact. If it was, I'd have a completely different viewpoint. It's a replica of a replica. So I think everybody here at the Roundhouse probably knows the basic story of where Dave Clokey came up with this. As everybody probably knows, the National Park Department had O'Connor Engineering build a replica of the Jupiter and a replica of the 119 that were delivered in, I guess, 1974, 75. And they're there today. And those are the replica steam engines that are operating at the Promontory historical site. So when Dave Clokey, as Dave Clokey says, he told some associate, I'd like to, those are really nice engines. I'd like to build a steam engine. And somebody told Clokey, oh, you can't do that, which made Dave Clokey determine he was going to do it. So Dave got a hold of O'Connor Engineering and to see if he could borrow the construction blueprints and all the stuff to make the castings to make all the stuff. And they said, well, you'll have to check with the National Park Department. They own all that now. And so Clokey made an arrangement with the Parks Department, and they let him borrow everything he needed to build a replica of the Jupiter. And so that's what he did. And Dave was already a welder and fabricator. He got his license to build a pressure vessel, and so he built the boilers himself for the Leviathan and for the 17. And he was also a machinist, so, he used all the stuff that O'Connor used to build the replica of the Leviathan. I mean, as you may know, when Central Pacific bought the four identical locomotives from Schenectady, they were numbered 60 through 64. They each had a name, the Jupiter, Leviathan, the Whirlwind, and the Storm. So when Clokey decided to build a replica of the Jupiter, well, there's already a replica of the Jupiter, so out of the other three names, he liked the name Leviathan, so that's how it came, why it was the Leviathan, number 63. Well, when the Abels got it, our goal here is not to interpret Central Pacific Transcontinental Railroad history. Our goal here is to interpret 1865 Abraham Lincoln funeral train time period. So, it's like I said, it's not an antique. It's not a artifact. It's so certainly I had no problem with them wanting to change the name and change the number of it. It's not an artifact. If it was, I'd have a completely, you wouldn't touch an artifact like that. If you were going to restore it, you'd restore it back to whatever it was. So David Abel said to me, he goes, one day, he says, well, Steve, he goes, what locomotive did pull the Lincoln funeral train across this property? And I said, well, it's a 440, but it's a Baldwin locomotive built earlier than 1868. It's a coal burner. It's got a different pilot. It's got a different smokestack. It's got a coal-burning diamond smokestack versus a wood-burning balloon smokestack. It's got a wooden cab. So, it looks like it's a 440, and it looks like the Leviathan kind of, if you squinted, look, it's a 440. So, I told the Abels, I said, if we're going to rename it, because what they wanted to do was re-letter the Leviathan to what was on the locomotive, the Baldwin Pensy engine that pulled Lincoln's train through the property. So in the course of researching that, I discovered that the lettering on the tender that Pensy used in 1865, it was a livery that they only used for 4 years. 1864, 65, 66, and 67. And after 67, they got rid of it and went to something different. So Kurt Bell was very instrumental, and Steve Miola at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in researching and finding out the exact name of the font. And, we got a graphic and so forth. And we had a photograph, there's a really good photograph of the locomotive sitting in Harrisburg in 1865 that you can blow up and see the tender lettering real good. So we replicated what was on the tender lettered. To start with, it was Pensy engine number 331, so we changed the number of this to 331. We don't, if you look at our website, if you look at any of our marketing collateral, we do not in any way, shape, or form do we say that this locomotive is exactly like the one that pulled Lincoln's funeral train. We are all very cognizant that we can't make that claim. So if you look at what everywhere that we talk about our train, we just simply say the locomotive is like the one that pulled Lincoln's train, because that's honestly the best you can do. And besides the fact that we're trying to not interpret transcontinental railroad history or Central Pacific history, and we're trying to interpret, this earlier period, another, what I think is a very interesting aspect to the name change is that, as I mentioned earlier, the company here is a faith-based company, and biblically, a Leviathan is an evil sea monster that is sent by Satan to destroy ships and kill sailors. So from a biblical standpoint, the Abels were not exactly warm and fuzzy with retaining the name Leviathan.
Bernard Kapinski, along with what we've been talking about with the paint, asks, how did they decide on the color scheme, especially the boiler?
We didn't change any of that. So we changed nothing that Dave Clokey, as he built the engine, the way he painted all that. The only thing that we've done is on the on the sides of the tender, on both sides, we simply, where the big letters that said Leviathan, we removed those and repainted that section, matching the paint, and then applied the Pensy lettering, and then changed the number on the sand dome and the number on the number plate, and then the number 331 is on the back panel of the tender. So everything else on the locomotive is as we got it from Dave Clokey, and if there's absolutely no there's no interest or desire to further cosmetically change the look of this locomotive to match the Baldwin locomotive that pulled Lincoln's funeral train, you'd have to. It would just be a insurmountable, amount of money to rebuild it to make it look like that. It's a 440, and so the scholars and the people like here in the Roundhouse, they can all tell the difference and put the pictures side by side of an 1868 Schenectady locomotive and a 1863, 64 Baldwin 440, and everybody that knows can tell the difference. But to mom and dad and the kids riding the train, it's charming.
It does look charming. I'm really looking forward to being able to see it in person at some point in the not too distant future. Chris Kovacs asks, even though the railroad is an insular operation, as in it doesn't have any rail connection to the outside world, does it still have to abide by FRA regulations?
Well, the answer to that is no. Being you're a completely insular railroad if you're not connected to the general system, and if you do not cross over a public grade crossing or cross over a public waterway. If you were an insular railroad not connected to the general system, and if you crossed over a public highway or a public waterway, then you would have to be compliant. So we are completely insular. But Dave Clokey, because of the business model he had of renting the locomotive out to tourist railroads, the locomotive was built in compliance. There's maybe 3 or 4 of the safety appliances. As an example, the grab irons, instead of meeting part 238 specs where they are solid, these have brass tubular brass grab irons. So and it doesn't have FRA glazing in the cab windows. So there's a number of those that Dave got a waiver for. So other than those few items that were waived, the locomotive has been kept with a Form 4 and FRA compliance. And when he sold the locomotive, we went through the process of registering with the FRA the new owners and reapplied for the waiver. They came out and inspected it. Everything was just as it should be. And so our waiver is there on file, and the locomotive carries a current cab card. And so because of my history in the business and working with the FRA most of my career, it's just made perfect sense to me that, let's keep the locomotive compliant. It'll meet all the safety standards that everybody has to meet. If there's ever a problem, nobody can point the finger at us and say that, we're just playing trains in the backyard. So we do all the paperwork and do everything we're supposed to and to be compliant. And the FRA is, they've come once to inspect the locomotive, and we stay on top of it. And then, of course, also the locomotive, the real agency that the locomotive has to have a certificate to operate under is the Department of Labor and Industry here. Has to have a boiler certificate from the state. So when we do our hydro test, we have the state boiler inspector here, and then we invite the FRA inspector to come.
Looking at technology like this and seeing where some of it did have to change in order to directly be FRA compliant and other elements had waivers, it gives you an appreciation for how much locomotive technology and railroading technology as a whole has evolved. Zach Leo, hope I pronounced it right, Zach, asks, which features of 19th century railroading equipment do you think are the most ingenious? Which aspects of railroading in that time period seem to captivate the public when they see machinery like this?
I would look at that as like the question is sort of a two-part question. What aesthetically, aesthetics are there that, there are? And then he's asking about, mechanical aspect to it. So, I'd say for me, mechanically, the thing that I find most intriguing about this design, so it's a Schenectady locomotive. Schenectady, as all the Roundhouse members probably know, it eventually became the Alco, American Locomotive Company. What I did learn from the fellows in, which is kind of an interesting note, what I learned from the fellows over in Promontory, they recently discovered that when the Central Pacific ordered their 4 locomotives from Schenectady in early 1868, they went on the cheap and they just picked the cheapest catalog 440 model that Schenectady had. And that, they discovered, was an 1863 design that Schenectady had developed, and it was just basically the bottom of the line, production model. So even though it was built in 1868, it's really technically it's an 1863 design. What they learned about the 119 is Dr. Durant, he wanted to be able to, he was a boastful, prideful man, and he wanted the UP to have bragging rights. So when he decided on having the 119, when he ordered that from Rogers, he wanted the most up-to-date modern locomotive that possibly could be produced. So as Richard Carroll out at Promontory has told me, he said, when you look at the Jupiter next to the 119, it's very clear that one is an older design versus the 119, which was really a lot more technically advanced. So that's kind of interesting. So, but for me, I think mechanically, what's very outstanding is the simplicity. This locomotive has Stevenson valve gear, which is extremely simple, and it's just simple, And Dave Clokey did put crosshead water pumps on this thing that are just, they're there, and they don't operate, but they're there. They could operate, but he, put more modern water injectors on it in order to be compliant. So, you don't really see that. What you see are these crosshead pumps, and that's, they're just there for show, but they look great.
For me, when I look at the Jupiter or the Leviathan, that class, what I love most about it, and why personally I like it more than the 119, is the stack. There's something about having that big stack that just screams Western, and obviously some Eastern roads had it or variations of that. But there's just something so captivating about that aesthetic of that era of locomotive construction, where the 119 has the more modern straight stack.
That's Nick has answered easily. The Central Pacific, all their locomotives were wood burners, and the Union Pacific were coal burners, and so that's the difference. When Dave Clokey, when O'Connor Engineering built the replicas for Promontory, they were built as oil burners, and they have since converted both the locomotives to their original fuel source. So the Jupiter replica now burns wood, and the 119 burns coal. When Dave Clokey built his replica for ease of operation, so it could go anywhere and operate anywhere, he decided to make an oil burner out of it. Oil burning apparatus is not modern. They were experimenting with it in the late 1870s and the early 1880s. the Southern Pacific Railroad had virtually converted all of their locomotives to burning oil before 1900 because there's no coal on the West Coast. But what do you have on the West Coast? The West Coast, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida. What's the fuel source? Oil. Colorado, Wyoming, the Great Lakes, the Eastern Seaboard. It's coal. So the West Coast, they all went from wood burners basically to oil burners. All the other places, they just were always coal burners because that was the natural fuel source. And to answer another part of the question of the aesthetic things about the locomotive that I find very that I like to tell people when they see this locomotive is whenever you see whenever we see a photograph from the Civil War period or from the 19th century, we're looking at black and white photographs. Well, if you were to see these locomotives photographs, these pictures of these trains in color, this is what you would see. It doesn't look like that in a black and white photo from 1865, but all this bright, brass work, and that's how the locomotive manufacturers competed with each other. It's a 440, but look, ours is fancier, and that's basically the main story with all of the 18th and 19th century thought process into designing mechanical apparatus. It all had to be very extremely attractive and pleasing and aesthetically. Look at all the fancy metal work and brass work in boiler rooms of ocean liners that just only guys shoveling coal would look at every day. Passengers wouldn't go down there and see that, but that was the mindset of that time period, was that it has to mechanically work, but it also has to be beautiful.
Which is why it's so funny when TV shows depict engines of this era being dirty, because it was a source of pride for crews to keep them as clean as possible.
Absolutely. The latest examples that you cite are, Hell on Wheels, and, the replica things they built. I mean, it's the grungier the better. Well, that's not what the locomotives look like.
Jonathan Shaw says, seeing that the Leviathan did visit Steam into History a few years back, which is not too far from its current home, are there any plans to perhaps one day have the engine visit tourist lines in the area, such as Steam into History or perhaps Strasbourg?
I don't think so. Now, I'm not the owner of the equipment, so I don't think I can definitively say that. I was there with the Leviathan when we visited Steam into History in 2013. I think it was 13. And that was a fantastic event and was really fantastic seeing both those engines together. I guess I can't speak for Mr. Abel on this question, but if I guess I was a betting man, I would probably say that the likelihood of this train or locomotive leaving the property is probably not anything that's realistic.
Jason Moyer asks, knowing that there's plans for about 3 miles of track and only 3/4 of a mile of old Pennsylvania Railroad grade, how will the rest of the track be laid out? Will it be a loop?
Well, this is very interesting. So David Abel picked the track layout, and David, he's also his lifetime model railroader, and so he kind of thinks he thinks in those terms. So he's thought of all the elements of what do I want to show the people and the kids today and future generations what mid-1860s railroading was like. So we're using harp switch stands. There'll be a wooden working water tower. There will be at one point on the route, there's going to be a 450-foot long open deck timber trestle that the train will go across. At one point on the line, the train will go through one half of the 1844 Herr Mills covered bridge. And at one end of the railroad, there'll be a big loop. And at the other end of the railroad, there will be a turntable. And we are basing the construction of our turntable off of the early 1870s wooden Armstrong gallows turntable that is at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. That me and some assistants will push around by hand. So he wants to build a high ball signal so people can see how that works and what that looked like. So it's quite an amazing thing.
It's going to be fun to watch this evolve, and I'm sure it must be fun for you to be part of all of this construction and developing this really unique railroad. At the end of the day, what makes you most excited and thankful about what you're doing here at the Harrisburg, Lincoln, and Lancaster?
I just turned 61, and I had the previous company I worked for, I was with for about 15 years, and I had owned and operated my own tourist railroad for a few years back in the old days, and prior to that I had been an 18-year veteran of the Florida Central Railroad down in Plymouth, Florida. And so it's just, and my original railroad job was at the Sierra Railroad. So I'm from California, I'm from Southern California, and I grew up watching Petticoat Junction, and every summer, once we discovered that the exterior shots of Petticoat Junction were filmed at the Sierra Railroad, that was the every summer vacation that I made my mom drag me to. And so for many years, all the guys that worked at the Sierra Railroad kind of saw me grow up, and and I guess maybe just to shut me up, the general manager said, "Okay, when you get out of high school, we'll put you to work." 2 days after I was out of high school, I graduated when I was 17. 2 days later, I was in Jamestown, California, and went to work. So that was my first railroad job, was working in a place that was, stuck in the past, with a 1910 roundhouse and all the original locomotives, and from the early 20s, and the Sierra number 3, a 19th century locomotive. And so and it was the place where they filmed Petticoat Junction. So it just sort of seems like I've come full circle, that I started my railroad career at a place that had 19th century equipment. And here I am. I'm on the back end of my career, and I've ended up, kind of back where I started. And it just seems like everything I've done throughout my whole career has been a big learning experience to that I can apply all that to what I'm doing here. Where Mr. Abel doesn't necessarily want to be a 5, 6, 7 day a week tourist railroad operation. He doesn't want to do that. We'll have a very limited schedule that will operate special events. So it's he's not looking at it as he's looking at it less as a commercial thing, as it's more of a aesthetic thing for people to enjoy while they're on the property and see what this, and hear this Lincoln story and celebrate that. So I'm just thankful. I think that I was meant to be here, and I've been very fortunate to. I don't have a staff. It's just me, and we have a mechanical contractor, and we have the rest of the train crew are all contractors that work for us when we run the train. And so I'm very blessed to have a group of fellows that all really like this and enjoy this 19th century, thing that we're trying to put on. And so, I don't think I could be any happier at, what I'm doing right now.
It's a terrific partnership that you get to find something that builds on everything you've experienced in life up to now, and a celebration, and one that the rest of us can enjoy anytime that we pay the railroad a visit. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the Roundhouse and talking about this railroad and what you're developing and the history behind it and that era of railroading. Their website, hlrr.com. Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. And yes, all the fans of the Roundhouse, please come visit us. It's not an expensive train ride, and just mention the Roundhouse and you get a free cab ride. So there you go.
Ooh, there's a good deal. Mention the Roundhouse, get a free cab ride. You gotta take up on that.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Steve Patterson, a rail historian who is an expert in the ski train. And what a great time of year to talk about holiday trains in general. So I posed the question to you guys, what is your favorite holiday train? Which elicited a lot of interesting responses. From Facebook, Eric Capusta says it's a tie between Lionel Electric trains, the Paramarkit 1225, and the CSX Santa train. Each one of them comes to mind when you think about trains and Christmas, both in terms of holiday flavor and the spirit of the season for doing something special for people and for creating memories of giving back. A lot of you also mentioned the CP, Canadian Pacific Holiday Train, which I would agree with you, especially because this past year they brought out beloved steam locomotive number 2816. It was great to see that fired up after so many years of it being on display. That was a nifty video presentation that they put together. If you go to Canadian Pacific's Facebook page, there's a lot of music performances, but you can kind of skip to the parts with just the steam locomotive if that's your thing. From YouTube, Clear Track Speed writes, my personal favorite holiday train is for sure the Polar Express. There's so many iterations of it that it's a joy to experience every time. I agree with you, Clear Track Speed. Mainly the book. I will say, I don't know if I've actually watched the film end to end. The question of the day for this episode is, what interests you about pre-1900s railroading? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com, where we have links to social media. You can also support us on Patreon if you love the podcast and you love the fact that you can get it for free and want to help support us as we go into 2021 and looking forward to covering events which will hopefully happen this year. Patreon.com/theroundhouse. I really appreciate all of you who support the show. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.